Classical harmony includes various standard dissonance formulas, familiar to anybody who's ever taken an elementary harmony course. Sometimes the history of 20th century music is presented as the emancipation of the dissonance, but that's a problematic idea. Originally, dissonance was a way of creating little moments of tension in a line, making it more interesting. In effect, dissonance helped the melody to breathe. Dissonance in vocal music imposes various constraints because it's hard for a singer, especially an untrained singer, to attack a dissonant note without any preparation. The easiest way to prepare a dissonance for a singer is simply to hold a consonant note while the other parts change harmony around it, making the held note into a dissonance. In other words, a suspension. Preparing a dissonance by step is also relatively easy to sing. This is important because the effect of a dissonance is partly due to the intervals that make it up, but also due to the amount of surprise it creates in context. Leaps create a sense of accent on the arrival notes, so combining leaps and dissonance gives a more potent result. With the arrival of instrumental music, dissonance treatment became freer, since instruments tend to have specific positions or fingerings associated with each note, making it easier to find, even in a harmonically more complex context. The appoggiatura is the classical example of an instrumental form of dissonance. That, however, eventually found its way into vocal music as well. As is well known, during the 19th century, dissonance was also used more intensively, for example, in Wagner. When historians speak of the emancipation of the dissonance, presumably they mean that it was used less and less with constraints, particularly as instrumental music got more and more virtuoso. The problem is that while the vocal constraints were no longer necessary in instrumental music, alternating dissonance and consonance allows the music to breathe, with little moments of tension and repose. And this is a musical phenomenon that goes beyond any one style. While it's possible to create effects of tension and release with other aspects of the music, like dynamics and orchestration, are there ways to use dissonance without simply returning to the classical formulas, but maintaining its potential for varying the musical surface? The answer is clearly yes, and composers like Shostakovich show us how to do it. Anyone who's familiar with Shostakovich symphonies will remember, for example, the last movements of the 13th and 15th symphonies, where very dissonant passages eventually get resolved into gentler, more consonant codas. In each of these symphonies, the codas turn around one single consonant chord, creating a moving sense of peace after conflict. The point here is that while Shostakovich also sometimes writes fiercely dissonant passages, there is much variety in the degree of dissonance overall, making the music much more interesting and accessible than if a high level of dissonance just remained constant all the time. We feel that the form breathes as a whole, with very intense moments tempered by others that are gentler and calmer. The contrast throws both situations into greater relief, adding to the music's overall expressive power. To do this effectively requires a scale of dissonance, and that's what we'll examine here. We need to think of harmony not as black and white, dissonant or consonant, but rather as exploiting different degrees of dissonance at different times. The perceived tension of a dissonance depends on several factors. Generally, in a tempered system, minor seconds are the most intense dissonances. In a chord with multiple dissonances, it's the minor seconds that create the strongest effect. But there are other factors which also influence the result. Let's listen to the first chord here. This chord contains every interval class. An interval class is defined as an interval or its inversion. The strongest color, of course, comes from the minor second between D and E flat. Now let's experiment a bit. Here's another version. Same chord, but with the E flat raised an octave. Notice that the dissonance appears a bit more transparent. This is typical. The more registral separation between two dissonant notes, the less tension. Now, example 3. Here, the E flat has become an E natural. There are no minor seconds in the chord anymore. The effect is gentler. Example 4. Now there are two minor seconds, D to E flat and A sharp to B. As you would expect, the result is more intense. Example 5 is the same chord with the two minor seconds but spread out. Let's listen. Example 6 is the same thing but spaced even wider. Again, the more the registers separate the dissonant notes, the gentler the effect. We could carry this even further by changing the orchestration. Up till now, everything has been for strings. Let's use more varied colors, repeating the chord from example 6. Listen. Now the lowest note is in the horn and the highest two notes are in the flutes. Since the minor seconds are no longer in the same orchestral families, we hear them as somewhat different planes of tone, thus further softening the dissonant effect. Now listen to example 7. This is a similar chord, but the A-sharp-B dissonance has become A to B flat. But the important difference here is now there's an octave and a fifth in the lower parts. This creates a kind of acoustic support, and it tends to make just about anything above it sound more tonally anchored. These are important principles governing the way dissonances are perceived. A composer can use these distinctions to create variety in the musical texture, or breathing as I like to call it. Finally, listen to example 8. Here, there are 4 semitone dissonances packed into a closely spaced chord. What's interesting here is that there is a limit to how intense things can get. Oh, pardon me, I played an extra note not in the written chord, E natural. You didn't notice? I wouldn't have noticed either. Here's the chord as written. Not much difference. The point is that after a certain degree, there's not much audible advantage to adding more dissonance, the whole just becomes gray. A good composer will use the scale of dissonance to create many expressive effects. This is the real emancipation of the dissonance, not to make it omnipresent, but to use it sensitively to around more expressive nuance.